Every movie about Prohibition shows Al Capone, Tommy Guns, Flappers dancing the Charleston, and Elliot Ness saving the day. I'm gonna show you 27 facts about what the period was really like that don't appear in any of those movies. Not because filmmakers didn't know, but because the truth is infinitely more disturbing, more ironic, and stranger than anything Hollywood would have the guts to show. Fact 1. Prohibition was passed by people who kept drinking. Here's an irony few people know. In 1917, when Congress passed the 18th Amendment, several senators who voted yes had already built up their own private liquor reserves at home, stockpiles big enough to last through all 13 years of Prohibition. The most famous case was President Warren Harding. He voted for Prohibition as a senator, but kept a well-stocked bar inside the White House between 1921 and 1923. When the press demanded an explanation, the answer was simple. The whiskey had been bought before 1920. And believe it or not, that was perfectly legal. The amendment banned making, transporting, and selling alcohol, but it never banned keeping it at home. In other words, if you were already rich before it started, you could keep raising a glass without a problem. Fact 2. Prohibition was created to target immigrants, not alcohol. Here's something school books don't tell you. Prohibition was never just about alcohol. The Anti-Saloon League, which shoved the law through Congress in 1920, had a nativist agenda. Its chief strategist, Wayne Wheeler, made it clear in private letters that the real targets were Italian, Irish, and German bars, where those immigrant communities gathered, talked politics, and organized votes in working-class neighborhoods. The goal was to break those communities from the inside, and it worked perfectly. Immigrant saloons shut down, families lost their livelihoods, and entire neighborhoods went quiet. Meanwhile, private clubs for the Anglo-Saxon elite in New York and Boston kept serving scotch without a problem, using stocks they had stored before the law took effect. Fact 3. The first bootlegger. Arrested in the U.S., was only 11 years old. Yeah, my friend, get this. The first American arrested for bootlegging after Prohibition was an 11-year-old boy. That's right, 11. It happened in Louisville, Kentucky, on January 20th, 1920, just one day after the 18th Amendment took effect. The kid was carrying a bottle of whiskey for his father, probably without really understanding what he was doing. Agents from the Prohibition Bureau let him go without formal charges since he was a minor, but his name stayed in the official records forever. And here's another curious detail. The second person arrested for bootlegging was 73 years old. The law didn't care about anyone's age. When it was convenient for the authorities, of course. That was how America treated alcohol back then. If you're enjoying these crazy Prohibition stories, go ahead and hit like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next insane facts coming up. Trust me, the next one will surprise you even more. Fact 4. The Ku Klux Klan was one of Prohibition's biggest supporters. It may sound strange, but it's true. In the 1920s, the Klan became one of the loudest voices defending Prohibition, especially in the South and the Midwest. And the reason wasn't morality, it was pure prejudice. In small towns, Klan groups raided speakeasies not because they were selling alcohol, but because many of them were run by Catholic and Jewish immigrants. In Indiana, where the Klan had as many as 300,000 members in 1924, it's estimated that 60% of the raids against alcohol were led or encouraged by the Klan, often hand in hand with the local sheriff. In other words, hooded men enforcing the law right alongside the police. Prohibition, which promised to clean up the country, ended up becoming a tool in the hands of the most violent group in American history. Fact 5. The non-alcoholic beer that turned into hard liquor in the kitchen. Here's one of the biggest loopholes in Prohibition, and not many people know about it. The government allowed so-called near beer, beer with less than 0.5% alcohol. But wort, the liquid before fermentation, was still completely legal. Hardware stores sold full kits with malt, hops, and a detailed instruction manual. At the end of the instructions, there was always the same warning. Do not add yeast, as this would make the drink alcoholic and illegal. Guess what happened? Between 1920 and 1925, yeast sales in the United States jumped 400%. Store owners pretended not to notice, customers pretended not to understand, and the basement of every house turned into a little brewery. The law tried to shut the front door, but forgot to lock the back window. Fact 6. The grapes that beat Prohibition with a label. When Prohibition took effect in 1920, few people imagined the loophole that would come next. The law allowed each family to make up to 200 gallons of non-alcoholic fruit juice a year at home. That's when California grape growers, who were on the verge of going under, found a way out. They started selling concentrated blocks of pressed grapes with a curious label, almost like a how-to guide, disguised as a warning. Warning: do not dissolve this block in 1 gallon of water, and do not let it ferment for 21 days, because the result will be wine with 12% alcohol content. The message had it all: the type of grape, the exact time, and the expected alcohol level. The result: sales from California wineries jumped 700% during Prohibition, all of it legal, and right under the federal government's nose. Fact 7. Roosevelt reached the White House, promising to end Prohibition. When Franklin Roosevelt entered the 1932 presidential race, he did something nobody else had the guts to do. He promised to make alcohol legal again. He called Prohibition a crazy experiment and made ending it a core part of the New Deal. And it was a smart move. With the country devastated by the Great Depression, he argued that taxing alcohol would bring money into government coffers and ease the burden on the American worker. People bought the idea. Roosevelt won with 57.4% of the vote, a historic landslide. On December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, and bars were legally allowed to open their doors again. In the end, Prohibition lasted exactly 13 years, 10 months, and 19 days. A chapter that permanently changed the United States' relationship with alcohol and organized crime. Fact 8. Speakeasies were cleaner than legal saloons. Believe it or not, it's true. Before Prohibition, old American saloons were known for dirty floors, overflowing spittoons, and restrooms only for men. When Prohibition hit in 1920 and alcohol became contraband, something curious happened. Speakeasies, those hidden bars behind fake doors, couldn't advertise anywhere. Their only promotion was word of mouth. And that's the key. To keep customers coming back, owners had to make the place worth it. Inspections from the time showed that mid-range and upscale underground bars were in better shape than many of the legal saloons that came before them. Cleanliness became a selling point, and there was more. Speakeasies started offering separate restrooms for women, something that was extremely rare in the old saloons. It was there, in the dark, that the modern American bar started to be born. Fact 9. Women started drinking in public during Prohibition. Here's something you may never have stopped to think about. Before Prohibition, a respectable woman simply did not set foot in a saloon. If she did, her reputation would be ruined on the spot. Bars were for men, period. Then came the irony of history. When alcohol became illegal in 1920, speakeasy owners realized something. If they wanted to make more money, they needed to double their customer base. And that's when they invited women in. The result changed America forever. For the first time, men and women were drinking in the same room, dancing together, and talking openly. The law that was supposed to end drinking ended up opening bar doors to women. Without meaning to, the government created the biggest social revolution between the sexes the country had ever seen. Fact 10. The U.S. government itself threw in the towel in 1927. Here's a story not many people know. In 1927, the Prohibition Bureau, the federal agency in charge of enforcing prohibition, wrote an internal report marked confidential. And what was in it? An admission that the law simply wasn't working in the big cities. The agents themselves estimated that just to bring New York under control, they would need 15,000 men working full-time. More people than the United States sent to the trenches in World War I. The following year, someone leaked the document to the New York World, which published the whole thing word for word. And do you know what happened after that? Absolutely nothing. Washington pretended not to notice, and the law stayed on the books for 5 more years. Fact 11. Al Capone moved more money than a lot of American cities, and none of it was on the books. Here's one that'll leave you speechless. Back in 1911, at the height of Al Capone's empire in Chicago, his organization was bringing in about $60 million a year. But here's the strange part. Estimates say more than $75 million went out in bribes. That's right, more than he officially took in. That money went into the pockets of police officers, judges, city councilmen, and mayors. And here's the part few people talk about. Many of those corrupt officials came from poor immigrant neighborhoods and ended up funneling part of that money back into their own communities, paying widows' bills, buying food, and covering rent. Decades later, economists gave this a name: redistribution through corruption. It's strange to think that crime, in a way, was helping support honest families. Fact 12. The end of Prohibition wasn't about morality, it was about money. Look, everyone thinks Prohibition ended because the country finally came to its senses about alcohol. That's not really what happened. In December 1933, when the 21st Amendment was passed, Uncle Sam was broke. The Great Depression had drained the Treasury, and the federal government was running a $2.6 billion deficit. Making alcohol legal and taxing it again meant hundreds of millions flowing into government coffers overnight. Morality, that took a back seat. Roosevelt went straight to Congress and said it plainly: "We need this revenue." Yeah, my friend, 13 years of banning whiskey, filling up jails, and making Capone's mafia richer. And in the end, what reopened the bar was the bank account, not the conscience. Fact 13. Nuns could legally make wine during Prohibition. Here's one not many people know. When Prohibition took effect in 1920, the government left a huge loophole. Sacramental wine, used in religious ceremonies, was still allowed. Convents, monasteries, and parishes could produce and distribute it without any trouble with the law. And look what happened. Between 1920 and 1933, sacramental wine production shot up 800,000%. By 1922, there was enough religious wine in the United States for every American Christian to have a glass a day. Guess what happened next? Any smart guy would declare himself the minister of some improvised church and go buy wine legally over the counter. While federal agents were smashing barrels in the streets, wine was flowing freely through the back door of faith. Fact 14. Prohibition gave birth to the fruit juice industry. Here's something few people know. Before 1920, bottled fruit juice barely existed on American store shelves. Fruit was something you ate fresh or preserved, period. Then Prohibition came along and changed everything. With alcohol banned, people started fermenting drinks at home, and demand for concentrated juice shot up. Apple growers in West Virginia, grape growers in California, and cherry growers in Michigan found a gold mine selling concentrates that, on paper, were just juice. The whole system of factories, bottling, and distribution built during that time became the foundation of the billion-dollar industry that stocks supermarkets today. Next time you open a bottle at breakfast, remember, it started because Americans wanted to get around the law. Fact 15. Hoover promised a chicken in every pot and real prohibition. Think about this. In 1928, Herbert Hoover won the White House by selling Americans two dreams: a chicken in every pot, a car in every garage, and the promise to finally make Prohibition actually work. People bought it. 11 months later, Wall Street collapsed in October 1929. By 1932, 1 out of every 4 workers was unemployed. Soup lines stretched around street corners, and speakeasies were packed despite the ban. The same voters who had trusted Hoover turned their backs on him and handed the presidency to Franklin Roosevelt, who promised something much simpler: jobs and legal beer. In the end, Hoover put those promises in a drawer, and the average American was left without the chicken in the pot and without the beer in the glass. If you're enjoying these crazy Prohibition stories, go ahead and hit like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next insane facts coming up. Trust me, the next one will surprise you even more. Fact 16. Federal agents had license to kill, and they used it. Here's a truth that few history books talk about. During Prohibition, between 1920 and 1933, agents from the Prohibition Bureau were given permission by the government itself to shoot any suspect who tried to run. That's right, a guy speeding away with a few bottles of whiskey in the trunk could get shot in the back, and it was all legal. The numbers are chilling. At least 360 Americans were killed by those federal agents. Most of them regular drivers transporting liquor and small farmers running a still in the backyard. To give you an idea, the regular police killed about 400 people a year across all crimes combined. Prohibition agents killed at a rate 340% higher. The government declared war on its own people, and almost nobody talks about that today. Fact 17. There was a speakeasy inside Congress itself. Yeah, my friend, get ready for this one. While federal agents were kicking down doors all over Brooklyn and arresting ordinary citizens for a sip of whiskey, the very people who passed Prohibition were drinking freely in the basement of the Capitol. The place even had a name: the Hole in the Wall. It operated right under the nation's feet, with representatives and senators from both parties showing up without the slightest embarrassment. Whenever reporters pressed them, the excuse was always the same: it's medicinal liquor with a prescription. There was never a police raid, never an investigation. And you know why? The Capitol was guarded by Congress's own police force. In other words, they would have had to investigate themselves. One set of rules for the people, and a very different one for the ones up top, calling the shots. Fact 18. Canadian bootleggers were treated like heroes. Here's one not many people know. While our boys were risking their necks smuggling whiskey across the border, on the other side, in Canada, those same guys were seen as respectable businessmen. Yep, exporting alcohol to non-American destinations was perfectly legal there, and nobody asked too many questions. That's how Sam Bronfman from the Seagram family and Harry Hatch from Hiram Walker built fortunes shipping truckloads of liquor supposedly headed for Mexico. Funny thing is, the cargo rarely made it there. In 1928, Canada exported more whiskey for international use than in any other year in its history. And those same families, today, they're respected pillars of the liquor industry, with products you can find in just about any store. Fact 19. The first woman charged with bootlegging was a doctor. In 1921, Dr. Alice Hamilton became the first professional woman indicted under the Volstead Act. The reason? She was prescribing more than 100 doses of whiskey a week to patients at her clinic. That's right. Back then, whiskey was considered real medicine. Hamilton argued that alcohol treated angina, nervous conditions, and what they called nervous exhaustion. And look what happened. When she presented the medical records with each diagnosis properly documented, the case was dropped. But the story didn't end there. That decision opened a huge loophole, allowing doctors all over the country to prescribe far larger amounts of alcohol than the government had ever imagined. In the end, Prohibition really did have a hole in it, and the first person to slip through was a doctor in a white coat. Fact 20. Keeping 5 gallons of wine at home was legal. Here's one of those twists almost nobody knows about Prohibition. Get this. While the police were smashing barrels in the streets, federal law allowed each family to produce up to 200 gallons a year of non-intoxicating fermented fruit juice. Translated from legal jargon, homemade wine, plain and simple. The government bet that the phrase non-intoxicating would keep things under control, but it opened a loophole big enough to drive a truck through. In Italian and Jewish neighborhoods in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, where making wine at home was already a tradition passed down from one generation to the next, Prohibition ended up being a gift. Consumption in those communities went up, not down. In the end, the ban that was supposed to dry out America turned immigrant kitchens into small legal wineries. Fact 21. Jazz only became a national craze. Because of Prohibition, few people remember this, but jazz already existed before Prohibition. It was born in New Orleans around 1910, in neighborhoods where music was everywhere. The problem was that nobody outside that region paid much attention to it. Then Prohibition came in 1920 and changed everything. Speakeasies, those underground bars, needed music to draw in customers, and jazz was a perfect fit. Lively, danceable, and unlike anything people had heard before. That's where Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Fats Waller went from being unknown to becoming legends. Black musicians who never would have set foot in a respectable theater at the time found a stage in the hidden basements of Chicago and New York. That's the irony. Without the law that tried to silence American fun, jazz might have stayed stuck in New Orleans forever. Fact 22. The speakeasy that worked like a bank. Here's a story not many people know. In the 1920s in Chicago, Anton Kermack came up with a smart setup. The speakeasies in his neighborhood didn't just serve hidden liquor. They also worked as informal banks for Czech and Slovak immigrants, people who didn't have the papers to open accounts at real banks. You could deposit money, withdraw it, transfer it, and even get a small loan, all recorded in ledgers using Czech code words to throw the law off. When Cermak became mayor in 1931, that network became the backbone of his political power in the city. But the story ended badly. In 1933, he was shot and killed in an attack that many believe was actually meant for President Roosevelt. One man, two worlds, and a secret hidden inside a speakeasy. Fact 23. The Prohibition paradox nobody told you about. Here's something that'll make you rethink everything you know about Prohibition. When federal prohibition kicked in 1920, 33 states already had their own dry laws in place for years, some going back as far as 1910. In other words, in those places, liquor smuggling was already an old business, with roots, suppliers, and setups that had been in place long before the federal government got involved. Washington didn't invent bootlegging. It just slapped a federal stamp on a crime that was already thriving. And do you know who pushed back hardest against national prohibition? The very states that had never really had a taste of that kind of ban. New York, Illinois, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. Where alcohol had always flowed freely, the resistance was fierce. The moral of the story: banning something almost never works out the way people expect. Fact 24. Wealthy women fought for prohibition and were the first to break it. Here's a twist that few history books get right. In the years before 1920, it was upper-class ladies and suffragists who shoved prohibition through Congress. To them, the saloon was the villain, a place of drunk husbands, lost wages, and ruined families. But as soon as the law took effect, those same women became regulars at the fancy speakeasies of New York. At the famous 21 Club around 1988, nearly half the crowd was wearing dresses and pearls, something unheard of before. Before Prohibition, a respectable woman didn't walk into a bar. After it, drinking became a symbol of freedom. They pushed the law to control the working man at the saloon and ended up discovering on the other side of the bar a pleasure their husbands had always had, all to themselves. Fact 25. Not a single major speakeasy owner went to jail during Prohibition. Here's something almost nobody tells you about Prohibition. During the 13 years alcohol was banned in the United States, not one of the owners of the country's 20 biggest speakeasies spent a single night behind bars. Not one. The men behind the 21 Club, the Cotton Club, and the Green Mill went on with their lives as if nothing had happened. Who went to jail? The truck driver, the guy unloading the crates, the bartender pouring the drinks, the owners, untouchable. And the reason is simple: protection was bought. Cops, judges, and politicians got their envelope every week. The law came down hard on working people, while the powerful sat upstairs having dinner in the very same bar the police were supposed to shut down. Fact 26. Prohibition created the modern FBI. Here's something few people know. The FBI, as we know it today, was born because of bootleg whiskey. In 1924, J. Edgar Hoover took over the old Bureau of Investigation right in the middle of Prohibition. The country was overrun by gangs moving alcohol from coast to coast, crossing state lines like it was nothing. Local police couldn't handle it. So that's when the federal government stepped in hard. Hoover built fingerprint files, trained agents, created laboratories, and turned a small office into a national investigative machine. Every modern criminal hunting technique came out of that era. Without the bootleggers, without Capone, without all that chaos in the 1920s, the FBI we see in movies and on the news simply wouldn't exist the way it does today. Fact 27. The end of Prohibition brought more nostalgia than celebration. When the 21st Amendment passed in December 1933, a lot of people expected speakeasy owners to be popping champagne. But the opposite happened. Many of them stayed quiet, almost like they were in mourning. Think about it. For 13 years, they had built an entire world in the shadows, with passwords at the door, loyal customers, and that sense of adventure no ordinary bar could offer. Then suddenly, all of it was gone. Jack Legs Diamond, one of New York's best-known bootleggers, summed it up to a reporter in 1932. When Prohibition ended, the business would end with it, and it had been the most alive he had ever felt doing any kind of work. For those men, the speakeasy was never just about money. It was identity. It was being part of something nobody on the outside could really understand.